So welcome to everyone who's here. I think that someone emailed you a handout that I made to go along with this talk. You don't need it for the talk, it's there afterwards. And I'll put in the chat afterwards, I'll put my Gmail account, email account, so that you can contact me directly if you need a copy. So it basically is organized by the 6 gardening tips that I'm going to give you in a little bit later in the presentation. So basically, every photo that you see of critters or plants or gardens, unless it's labeled otherwise, comes from my wildlife habitat garden here in Houston, and I'm down in Houston, Texas. So our gardens are not that big. I mean, they look bigger than they actually are if you think about acreage. So our house is under 1,600 square feet, and the front and backyards are comparable in size. You know, they're proportional in size. And after having done this for about 7 years now, about 60% of our front yard is filled with native plants, or filled with plants. And I would say we're probably about 90% plants native to my ecoregion of Texas, which is Gulf Coast prairies and marshes. Little bit of overlap with some prairie plants with your ecoregion, but it's about 90%. And I can tell you that the biggest bang for the buck that I've had is going to plants native to my ecoregion, because the biodiversity has exploded. So when you see the biodiversity in my photos tonight, just think that in the heart of an urban area, you can have the very same thing by employing some of the tips we're going to discuss tonight. So let's talk first and foremost. I guess you could say this talk's broken into 3 parts: the what, why, and how of wildscaping. So we're going to talk first about what a wildscape is, and then what uses it. And then we're going to use that as a backdrop to understand why it's necessary to do this kind of gardening. And then we're going to end with just some easy tips. So quite unsurprisingly, a wildscape is any garden, the primary purpose of which is to support wildlife. So that's pretty easy to understand. But what does that actually mean? So let's unpack that for a minute. So it means that every choice that I make of plant, design, and even maintenance has this goal in mind. And when we get to the how part of the talk, I'll explain how that translates into concrete actions. We need to think of our gardens no longer as just having just aesthetic value, but as a community of plants and wildlife, yes, even in the heart of the suburbs and urban areas. So in urban and suburban areas, a wildscape is a little bit different from what we would imagine to be ecological restoration. So this talk is not about ecological restoration. We need ecological restoration, where we try and get things back to how they were before humans intervened and changed the way that the plants and animals lived on the land. But that's not what I'm talking about in this talk, because humans are here, and we have our homes here, and we have our communities here. So what I'm talking about with wildscapes is what Rainier and West describe as a designed plant community, or a hybrid of horticulture and ecology. So in urban areas, I think the point they're trying to make is that we need to take into account not just the garden itself and how it sustains, but also what the community thinks of it. And I will have to say that the most successful wildscapes are those that, in the words of my Audubon Society friend Sarah Flournoy, look intended instead of untended. So there has to be something in them and about them that makes them read garden. If they don't read garden, and they can't be interpreted as a garden in certain ways that we'll talk about later, then they're not going to be embraced by the community. And ultimately, we want more people to adopt this type of gardening. So I like to say that wildscaping is therefore about both critters and community. So because a picture is worth 1,000 words, I thought I would share some images of close friends' gardens that are preponderance or almost entirely plants that are native to my ecoregion here in Houston or down in Clear Lake, which is nearby. And you can see, and I think this is the biggest takeaway, that wildscapes are not one size fits all. They're actually on a sliding scale of more traditional to a blend or a mix to very, very natural in the way that they look. So this is an example of my friend Russ Kane, his family's home. This is in the heart of Houston. And I've called this a very traditional garden. It is almost entirely filled with plants that are native to our ecoregion. So I want you to see some of the things that he does in particular that make it look intentional. So for example, you see hardscaping, like on the bottom right, the pathway, right? And the gravel area, plus distinct chunky borders around more wildly filled garden beds. He also uses a significant amount of mulch. I'm actually in the camp of using leaves instead of a commercial mulch, but be that as it may, the reason he does that is that it separates the clusters of plants and reads more traditional. But this is fully supportive of wildlife. In the middle is the home of my dear friend and mentor, Jaime Gonzalez. So some of you may know Jaime Gonzalez. He works with the Texas Nature Conservancy here in Houston. He used to be with the Katy Prairie Conservancy. He's all about educating the population, and especially kids, about wildlife. And so this is his home in the heart of the Houston area. So on the left-hand side, what we see is his family's backyard. So again, very heavily native plants, almost entirely plants native to the ecoregion. Notice how wild and thickly filled the plant beds are. But look at the technique that he uses to make it reed garden. Although some areas have chunky borders made out of stone or wood, other areas simply have a sharp delineation between the thick and tall plants in the garden bed and the lawn in between. We call this green bordering. And to the eye, this reads garden, even though the middle of the garden bed is a lot more natural looking than those we saw in the first slides. On the right-hand side, we see what his family does every single spring. He takes clumps of dirt or soil that are filled with Texas wildflowers from our area, and he puts them in a geometric pattern in his front yard. And we'll stop all over to look at his family's wildflowers. This is another example of what I would say a blend or a mix of more natural and traditional. So here, this was down in Clear Lake, my friend's former home. This was almost entirely with native plants, well over 100 different species. The inside of the beds, again, were very thickly planted, densely planted, and a little wild looking. So look how they made it look intentional. So as a general rule of thumb, the thicker the border, the more it reads garden, especially when the interior of the garden is a little more natural. And this is the most natural one I'll show you today. This is to my taste, but it's not to everyone's taste. So this was my friend's former home in the Montrose area. There were no deed restrictions, so it's here in Houston. And there actually is hardscaping paths and arches and so forth. It's just that you really can't see them. So again, it runs the spectrum. And now I thought I'd share with you what my gardens in Houston look like. So my gardens, I would say, are mixed. They're sort of mid-level. We are about 90% species native to the ecoregion. But again, look how I've used pathways, which are used with repurposed concrete, and it's also a swale to capture water, and thick borders to make it look more intended and read as a garden would read. So those are examples of what they can look like. And again, the takeaway is sliding scale. So let's talk briefly about what pollinates within a wildscape. At the end of this, I want you to understand a little bit about those insect visitors who use our gardens so that we can understand why I recommend certain things for structuring our gardens, certain ways of doing our gardens. So of course, we all know that bees are tremendous pollinators. And so I'm going to share just a couple of fun facts with y'all. First thing I want to say is these are all taken in my home gardens here in Houston. I stopped counting at 30-something species of bee, and that was several years ago. So in North America, there are around 4,000 species of native bee. And in Texas, according to Dr. Jack Neff, about 1,100. And the honeybee is not one of them. The honeybee is a domesticated insect. It was brought in from Europe and other areas in order to produce honey here in North America. So our bees are quite different. Sorry. They range in size and they range in color. So who knew that these could be green or blue, or they could have red on them. And in fact, they run the range of size and color. So this is a participatory class, and I always like to say that those who don't participate, to channel Tom Lair, get to stay after class to clean the erasers. So you ready? So here's our first project. You ready, class? I want you to hold up your pinky finger, and I want you to look at the flesh tone part of your fingernail of that pinky finger. That flesh tone part of your pinky finger is the same size as the entire flower head in this middle flower. This is Phyllonoda or Texas frog fruit, or I think it's called turkey tangle frog fruit as well. That means that bee is smaller than that flower head, and that's not the smallest bee in North America. The smallest bee in North America is only a couple of millimeters big. I want you now, and I want you to look from the neck. So that's about the size of most bumblebees and of things like carpenter bees, like this eastern carpenter bee female here that I'm circling, or here. So they really, really range in size. Bees feed with a tongue. Their tongue is either longer or shorter, and they're often categorized that way. So keep that in mind, that they feed with their tongue. So butterflies are also pretty good pollinators, though not as good as bees. Butterflies feed differently from bees. They feed with what's called a proboscis. It's a long organ that does have a channel in the middle of it, but actually it works primarily action rather than suction. So that's why butterflies don't tend to drink out of things like bird baths, for example. Instead, they put their proboscis on damp soil or ground or even dung or carrion, and they absorb liquid that way, as well as getting it through nectar. Size as well. In the continental US is about the size of an average adult's hand, and that's the giant swallowtail, which we have here in my area, and I believe also in yours. And then some of them are so small that they're about the size of the flesh color in your thumbnail. In my home wildlife habitat gardens, as of last fall, I recorded 52 species of butterflies. So if you build it, they'll come. They're actually not as pollinator as bees, because at least the larger ones tend to stand away from the flower head. And so pollen really gets on their proboscis and their feet instead of all over their fuzzy body, which is what happens with bees. So moths, butterflies, it's Lepidoptera, which means scale wing. And here's a fun fact about butterflies and moths. What looks like hair on them is actually not hair. They're actually specialized scales. And indeed, their wings are also covered with specialized scales. So they too feed with a proboscis. They tend, although they're not entirely, they tend to be a little fuzzier than many butterflies. Many are nocturnal, but most of these that you see here are diurnal, and they feed during the day. I actually have no idea how many moths we have here, but we have quite a few. Now this blew my mind when I first started learning about pollinators. So I knew that those other things we talked about pollinated, but I had no idea that flies were good pollinators depending on the family of fly or the species. So flies have 3 different types of mouth parts, and the one that's really, the ones that are most relevant are, some of them have a proboscis like a butterfly, but many of them have a very shallow mouth part that's sort of like a sponge at the tip. And so those flies need to get very, very close indeed to the surface of the flower to get that nectar or pollen, which is why they tend to be fairly good pollinators, even though they're not that fuzzy. And here's the other cool thing about flies. Some of them, like this fly on the right in the middle, this one in the top right, and this one in the lower left, are in a family that we call hoverflies or Syrphidae. The cool thing about many hoverflies, not all, but many of them have large, so their babies eat your garden pests like scale, whiteflies, mealybugs, aphids, and they do a really good job of it too, right? When they're larvae. So a single hoverfly larva, depending on the species, can consume 200 to 400 aphids before it pupates. So it's double bang for the buck, right? Some of the larvae will keep your garden pest-free naturally, and then the adults will eat pollen or nectar and pollinate your plants. And wasps were also a revelation to me. So I am one with wasps. I love me some wasps. So here's the thing about wasps and bees. Only the females can sting you. Males have no sting. And most of our wasps and bees are what we call solitary nesters, meaning that they don't nest in highly structured communal hives or collective nests. Those bees and wasps that are solitary nesters tend not to be aggressive. The females aren't, because they're not really defending anything, right? So as long as you don't touch them, it's share and share alike in the garden. So most adult wasps will feed on nectar or pollen, and the females will feed, almost all of the species larvae feed on insects. So the larvae are predaceous, but the adults tend to be pollinators. And I had no idea about that. So you get double bang for the buck with wasps. Wasps will help keep your garden pest-free naturally. The females will, but then they will also pollinate. Not quite as well as bees, because they tend not to be as fuzzy, but they're still pretty good. And then finally, what I like to call the 4 Bs: beetles, bugs, bats, and hummingbirds, right? So any animal that, while enjoying the nectar or pollen reward of a flower, transfers the pollen from that flower to another part of the same flower or to another flower, that's a pollinator. And it could be any animal pretty much that feeds that way. Okay, so let's transition now to the why we need wildscapes, because honestly, I'm not a huge fan of telling people they need to change how they garden and not telling them why it's important. Why make people do something if you don't explain why? So in this section, I'm going to focus not just on pollinators. We're going to go a bit more broadly. I'm going to focus on insects generally, and in particular, those insects that are native to North America, native to, for example, the continental United States. So this is actually a really great study that came out. I think it was published, it says 2006. So it's going on over 15 years now, 16 years. But the thing that I like about this study is that the researchers tried to determine a dollar value for the ecoservices that are native insects in North America, not honeybees, native insects produced annually in just the United States. And their estimate, which they said was really low and not at all really close to what they actually provide, was $60 billion a year of ecoservices. So that's great, right? So that's what we need. So let's unpack a little bit what those ecoservices are. So of course, pollination. So about 2/3 of our crops require animal pollination, primarily insect, in order to propagate and to produce those fruits and vegetables. And that translates to about 1/3 of what's on our plate every day that we eat. Additionally, depending on the metric you look at, between 75 to 95% of the Earth's flowering plants need an animal to actually pollinate it. So they are not self-pollinated or wind pollinated or otherwise. And of course, the more plants we have, the more exchange of carbon dioxide for oxygen we get, the less erosion we have, and the more sequestration of carbon in roots or trunk if it's a tree. They're also important for the food chain. So indirectly, mammals and birds eat the seeds and fruits and nuts that pollination ends up producing. And of course, future plants' flowers will actually support the pollinators in future generations. But insects are also really, really nutritious, and they're a very important part directly in the food web. And so I want to spend just a moment using birds as an example. So birds, I think about a quarter of adult birds' diets tend to be supplemented with insects. Adult birds can also eat, as a general rule, also eat things like seeds and nuts and berries and fruits, right? But they will supplement at least their diet with some insects. That's not at all true, however, for their chicks. So 96% of terrestrial bird species, their chicks cannot eat anything but insects and other arthropods. In other words, they cannot digest the berries, nuts, grains, fruits that their adults, that their parents can consume. And so Dr. Doug Tallamy in Bringing Nature Home and also in Nature's Best Hope, and I'll show you those books later, he recounts a study. I don't know if it's one that he did, I can't recall, or if it's one that he was just discussing, where the researchers started thinking, well, then how many insects do they need to feed their chicks, right? We know the percentage about that need to consume insects and arthropods, but how many does that translate to? And so what they went to do was, by using Carolina chickadees, they went to explore what how many insects a single clutch in a single season would need to survive. And the answer was not dozens, and it wasn't hundreds. It was thousands. Thousands of insects are needed to feed one clutch of chickadees, one clutch. So what happens if we don't have insects for the birds to feed on? They either don't reproduce at all or in the same numbers, or if they do, their chicks might starve. So we need to make sure that there are insects for those higher levels of the food chain to consume directly. Insects are also really good at decomposition services. So they help recycle and break down dung, even carrion, dead plant matter. And when they die, their bodies decompose and actually nourish the soil. So I haven't actually used, I used to use natural fertilizers and compost from our own home, but I don't do that anymore. I think just plant matter that falls, as well as the great number of insects we have, when they die, our soil is pretty rich. And so I don't supplement it at all anymore, and haven't for a couple, 3 years. And finally, they're really good at pest control. Adults or larvae of various insects contribute about $4.5 billion annually in pest control services. So here's the problem. Insects are in a world of hurt. We're just starting to scratch the surface to understand the hardships that they're facing and the crisis that they're facing. But we know enough to know it's there. We also don't know precisely how much each of these drivers that you see on the screen contributes. And of course, different areas of the world, the drivers might be a little bit different, right? For different insect populations, it might be a little different. But it looks like most of these, at least from the studies that have been coming out in the last 10 years or so, are contributing to a serious decline in insect number and diversity. Among those, key are habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. So in my area of Texas, we were, as I've said, coastal prairie and marshes. And so most of that's gone now. I think according to Native Prairies Association of Texas, maybe 1% of Texas's original prairies still exist intact. And so we've carved it up or completely eliminated it. And we've also brought in things like invasive species of plant or animal that have also made it hard for our native insects populations to survive, as well as the use of pesticides and herbicides. And guess who are some of the worst abusers of pesticides and herbicides? It's home gardeners, like not reading labels, right? So all of these things are driving insect numbers. And what the researchers are telling us, and these are entomologists, they're calling it, at least in a January 2021 symposium, a paper that came out of it, they're calling it death by 1,000 cuts. The result is serious declines in insect abundance, diversity, and biomass worldwide. Again, we don't even know all the insect species that exist. Not every area has been tested. We're scratching the surface. But let me tell you, when entomologists take off their lab coats and come out of the lab in the middle of researching, and they say, we got a long way to go, but we can see the writing on the wall and it is not good, then we need to listen to them. And that's what they're doing now. They're calling for action from everyone now while they're still researching. It's that important. And this is at all levels: international, national, state, city, and individual. And I want to give you just one survey just to kind of give you an idea. It comes from Manga Bay News, which reports on the tropics quite a bit. It was a series of 4 articles it did that I highly recommend. It was called The Great Insect Dying, The Tropics in Trouble and Some Hope. And this was from June of 2019, so not too long ago. And in this article, the authors interviewed 24 entomologists from 6 continents, 12 countries represented by 6 continents, or falling in 6 continents. And they asked them this single question: on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is no problem and 10 is dire, how would you rate the insect abundance crisis? So of those 24 entomologists, no one said below 8, and some said 10. So it's not good. And there's really not a good way. There is no way to sugarcoat it. So I don't know about you, but every time I give this talk, and I finish that last slide, I'm thinking to myself, I need a rejoice and be glad moment. I need something that I can do moving forward to know how to fix this. So are you ready for that rejoice and be glad moment? Right here, right now, right in our own gardens. We form a critical link in the chain that can save insects and thus the ecosystem. Right here, right now, right at home. And we all know how a chain works, right? It's only as strong as each of the individual links in the chain. So I and we do not get a hall pass on trying to do whatever we think is best to help insects and the ecosystem at all of those levels entomologists are calling us to act in. International, state, local, regional, right? We still have to do our part, although for most of us, it's going to be indirect, right? We can't directly deal with treaties, international treaties, for example, and we can write our Congress people and do whatever else we feel personally is the right thing to do, but that's indirect. But flip that coin. That also means that what we do in our home gardens is just as important as all those other chains in that link, or all those other links in that chain. You can tell I get excited about this because I get tongue-tied. That's empowering. And I don't know about you, but that and a cup of coffee, that gets me going in the morning. To know that the choices that I make in my own garden can help fix this world of hurt that insects are in, and that the job can't be done without my part, that empowers me. And that guides me and motivates me to share with others. When we do this in our own home gardens, we create, in the words of some researchers, we create what they're calling stepping stones or biological corridors. In fact, Dr. Doug Tallamy, in his most recent book, Nature's Best Hope, which came out just, I think, 2020, fantastic book, by the way. If you haven't read it, read it. But he calls it a homegrown national park, and he started a registry so that people can register their individual gardens as part of homegrown national park. And his idea is we need to capture the acreage bit by bit in this fragmented world in our yards. And by doing that, we create bio corridors, or in the words of Crone, Brown, Hodgson, and Lucia and Schultz at the bottom, stepping stones. So that's why I like to say as well that it's less about the size of the garden that you have, but more about having the garden in the first place. And let's think back to those pollinators that we talked about before and that we met, right? Like some of those bees are like 2 to 3 millimeters big. There's no way they're getting from my garden all the way down to the center of town, near downtown, to Memorial Park, for example, or Herman Park. But they can, by gum, get from my house to my next door neighbor's Gaillardia pulchella. And they can go 2 houses down to the Salvia coccinea, right? And the Salvia lyrata in my other neighbor's yard. So we create stepping stones. These are the books that I was referring to before. These are both by Dr. Doug Tallamy. Bringing Nature Home was his first book in this, it's not really a series, but in this line. It's more than 10 years old. It's wonderful. Nature's Best Hope picks that up and continues with newer data and introduces that idea of homegrown national park. I highly recommend both, but if I had to recommend only one, I would recommend Nature's Best Hope, simply because it's the more current. Okay, are we motivated to learn how to do this in our home gardens? You bet. So I have 6 easy peasy steps, and I'm hoping to wind up about 10 till. I might wind up 5 till. I hope you can stick with me. Okay, so let's talk in 10 easy steps how to accomplish this at our home. And before I do that, I want to introduce you to some books on this kind of gardening, on the how of wildscaping, that I think are amazing. So the first, and I'm going to give you a little bit of information about each. So the first is The Living Landscape. And again, it's by Dr. Doug Tallamy and also Rick Dark, who is a landscaper who does naturescapes or wildscapes. So this is a great book for taking the why of Dr. Tallamy's other books. They're not how, they're why, and translating it into how you do it in your own garden. I would say that if you're a beginning gardener, a beginning level, this is the book for you. Planting in a Post-Wild World by Rainier and West. I mentioned it at the start when I was defining wildscape. I love this book. So this is what I would call probably an intermediate level. If you're a beginner, totally fine to get it, but I would probably start with The Living Landscape. So the thing about Rainier and West is that they don't espouse 100% native plants. They recognize the increased wildlife benefit of using plants native to the ecoregion, but their philosophy is any plant that works in the region now is good enough. So we understand why using native plants is superior. And I say that everything that they have in this book, all of the how tips that they have, totally works with native plants. So I would definitely have this book in my library. And finally, I love this book, Garden Revolution by Weiner and Christopher. This is way above my pay grade. This is very high level, extremely detailed, extremely good. And I'm still working my way through it months and months and months after having gotten it. It's a fantastic reference book. So I would recommend it, but it is a very more advanced level. Okay, so let's talk about these 6 tips. And I want to begin with what I call support the home team. And this basically means use plants native to your ecoregion. Because I'm speaking to a NEPSAT chapter, I won't spend as long on this as I normally do, but because it's being recorded and could be viewed by people who are not members of NEPSAT, and because I know we have Master Naturalist and others here, I want to spend a little bit of time on it. So gardening with plants native to your ecoregion is best. So let's talk for a minute about the meaning of native plant. When I first got into this back in 2015, 2016, I had no idea that there's actually somewhat of a difference of opinion as to what a native plant means. So I'm going to tell you sort of the definition that I use, and it's the one that Dr. Doug Tallamy talks about in his 2 books that I showed you. It's a plant having historical evolutionary relationships with a particular plant and wildlife community. So if you think about it, that has 3 aspects. Time. That plant has been there for millennia, not hundreds of years, not decades, millennia, so that it can evolve in that community. So time and then place. It's been there in those conditions of light, water, soil for millennia. And finally, time, place, and community. It is part of a web of life that has co-evolved with that plant, whether it's another plant or a critter, to be able to use that plant for food, for shelter, for whatever it's going to be used for. Those relationships can happen they can happen quickly, but usually not. They usually happen over long periods of time. So those ideas of time, place, and community. And frankly, I don't think you can say a plant is native if you don't think of it in the context of time, place, and community. There's no such thing as a native plant in the abstract. Okay, so why are they superior? Quickly, they feed more critters. So up to about 90% of plant-eating insects are specialists at some point in their development as larvae, as adults. And when I say insects, I mean 90% of plant-eating insects. So what does it mean to be a specialist? So a specialist is an animal, and I'm going to speak here of insects, that at that particular stage of its life can feed only on the nectar, on the pollen or leaf of only those plants in a particular family, genus, or species. So they've evolved to consume the pollen or leaf of plants in a small group. Okay, and an example of this is monarch butterflies and queen butterflies. We all know that their larvae consume pretty much only plants in the milkweed genus or Asclepias, whereas the adults in that phase can feed on nectar from pretty much any plant. We call them generalists at that point. So the vast majority of insects that eat plants at some point in their development are specialists. And so they have evolved to use the plants that they have evolved with. That's not saying that insects here cannot consume plants in the same family or genus from outside North America or our particular ecoregion. And a good example of that is the eastern black swallowtail. So the eastern black swallowtail is native to North America. And there are native plants, for example, in the carrot family that it feeds on here, prairie parsley and some others, I think. But it also feeds on Queen Anne's lace, the caterpillars do, and the caterpillars also feed on dill and rue, right, and parsley, and those are native to Europe and other places. So it's not an absolute rule of thumb, but it is a rule of thumb. So do I have to memorize what critters can feed on what plants in my garden? I could, but I don't have the time because I work full time, right? So instead, the more native plants I have that are native to this region, time, place, and community, the more likely I am to check that box so that the critters that live here can actually feed on them. And that change was the change in my garden that brought an explosion of biodiversity. Native plants also are hardier in our local climates. They've evolved there for millennia. In our part of Texas, in mine, they're used to being nuked in the summer and drowned in the spring. And so I spend less money replacing them. And frankly, in my gardens that you see here, I don't own a sprinkler. I spot water at the height of drought for only those plants that need to be given a little sip of water 2 or 3 times a week. But I have plants like firewheel or Gaillardia pachella, Texas lantana or Lantana urticoides, and others that I literally never water. And I've chosen them for that purpose. Native plants can also, depending on the type of plant, be pretty good at sequestering water and carbon. So I think that your ecoregion, it's a little bit different from mine. I think you're Edwards Plateau, correct? So historically savanna of different types, but it used to be very heavy on grasses. I'm guessing, I don't know, since you're also near Blackland prairies, that some of those grasses and forbs may have had deep roots indeed. I can speak about my prairie and Blackland prairies as well. So some of our prairie plants have roots that are 12 to 14 feet deep. And as a general rule of thumb, the deeper the root, the more water and carbon the plant sequesters below ground. And even if they burn, right, like prairie fires happened historically all the time, even if they burn, that carbon tends to stay below ground in the root instead of being released as much. So they can have that kind of beneficial effect as well. So first tip is plant with native plants. Second tip, avoid pesticides. Pretty straightforward. I cannot highly enough recommend this book. So this is by Jessica Walliser. It is not her only book on the subject, but I love this book, Attracting Beneficial Bugs to Your Garden. What I like about it is it introduces you to the different types of predators, both adult and larvae, that are insects in our gardens, and also explains how you attract the adults so that they will come and lay their eggs on your crop plants and garden plants so that the adults and larvae of that species can take care of your pests naturally. She also has designs of how to do to plant plants that draw in the predators you need alongside crop plants, because those particular predators, we call them companion plantings, I think, those particular predators that are drawn in, their larvae also eat, or the adults also eat the critters on that particular crop plant. So I find it a very helpful book. So the trick is to welcome predators and parasitoids into your garden for a healthy garden. And to paraphrase Dr. Talamy, once again, because he's awesome, if you have too many insects in your garden, then you probably need more insects, right? So insects take care of their own very well. It's just that we have to be patient and let things go in cycles. So let me give you an example. So how many of us have milkweed of some kind in our gardens? And we always get those yellow oleander aphids on our milkweed, don't we? And in fact, on the bottom left, you can see a little pink aphid that's feeding on one of my Gara. It happens to be a hybrid, it volunteered, but it's there. So I get aphids like everyone else does, along with mealybugs and whiteflies and so forth. The thing is that aphids exude that honeydew, that sticky, sugary, sticky fluid that comes out of them. And that fluid attracts the adults of various predatory and parasitic species of insect. So for example, on the top, in the top photos, we see the larvae of some of those hoverflies. Remember I mentioned those hoverflies where the larvae can consume 200 to 400 aphids before they pupate? These are two different species of hoverfly larvae. The mama was attracted to the honeydew, and then she came and laid her eggs. And so they're sucking up those aphids. Bottom right is the larva of a lady beetle. So the adult lady beetles and their larvae consume insects. You can literally see it eating that aphid on my milkweed. And the bottom left is not a great picture, but it's a great moment. This is a female wasp laying her egg inside that aphid. It will gestate and grow in there and hatch, eat the aphid from the inside out and hatch out of it as an adult. So what happens if I even use natural pesticides like soap-based ones or neem oil to get rid of my aphids, or even if I just squish them or blast them away? See, if I do that, I might be getting rid of the eggs of these beneficial predators. So instead, I let things go in natural cycles. Couple of weeks with aphids, couple of weeks with no aphids, over and over again. So what it requires is patience. Tip number 3, mix it up. So why do I suggest this? Because variety is the spice of life for humans as well as for insects. Remember when we met our pollinators before, we talked about all their different sizes and all their different mouth parts and how they feed differently. Because they have such different ways of feeding and they have different ways of moving and they're different sizes, we want to make sure that we stock the larder in our gardens with things that all of them can enjoy. So let's unpack that a little bit. So I want to choose flowers of different sizes and different colors. So different sizes. So for example, a giant swallowtail or an eastern black swallowtail or a monarch are bigger, and they need a sort of like maybe a composite flower, like a firewheel that's open, that they can really sort of land on and use as a landing pad while they feed. So we want to have some larger flowers and some smaller ones so that the larger ones can accommodate the larger insects. They also have differently sized mouth parts as well. So we want some with shallow floral rewards of nectar and pollen that can be reached easily with short tongues and spongy mouth parts like in flies, as well as those with a long proboscis. We also want to plant in different colors. And whereas I knew that humans and insects viewed colors differently, I didn't realize how much insects view colors differently from each other. So as an example, bees are really, really good at seeing yellow, white, and purple, but they're really not as good at distinguishing red from green. They will come to the red flowers in my gardens because they've learned that there's nectar and pollen there. But they're really attracted to white, yellow, and purple. In contrast, hummingbirds and butterflies are particularly attracted to reds. So again, I don't have to memorize which critters see which colors. I simply have to plant a bunch of different colors. And by the way, that makes my garden super pretty. I also want to choose flowers with different structures. Again, different mouth parts, different sizes. So I want some tubular, composite, umbelliform flowers. So things like dill, parsley, those, I know those aren't native, but they're native equivalents. Things like milkweed, that's umbelliform, and then mallow flowers. Composite flowers are particularly good bang for the buck. So if you have only a small space and you have to limit the number of your flower choices, I would definitely focus in on composite flowers because these ray petals are just the outer petals. This is not a unified center. This is dozens to like 100 or more little nectar rewards. So it's like the insect that lands on it is going shopping at a shopping mall where it can stay in the same mall and visit a bunch of stores to eat, right? In the food court, as opposed to having to drive around to freestanding buildings. So composite flowers work great for bigger insects as well as for teeny tiny ones. I also want to choose flowers that bloom in different seasons, right? Because the worst thing is to invite everyone in for the spring buffet. And so in spring and summer, I have lots of food, but nothing in the fall. So all that this means is that when I'm thinking about being intentional about the plants that I put in, I want some that bloom in the fall as well. I also want to layer the plants in my garden bed. So the white arrow up top is pointing to my little blue stem, okay, or I'm sorry, my big blue stem, which will get to be about 10 feet tall. This is in the early spring. There's also rattlesnake master around it. That's my high level. And so in my garden beds, in the center or in the back, if it's up against a structure, I want to have just a few tall focal point plants, things that really catch the eye and anchor the space. Even better if they still look nice when they're brown and gone to seed, right? Like rattlesnake master and big blue stem. Around them, I want to incorporate mid-sized plants like this Conoclinium coelestinum, which is blue mist flower. And then at the base, as green mulch, in the words of some landscapers and some wildscape experts, I want to use natives that are densely packed in lieu of mulch. Now, I can use mulch if that appeals to you more. I tend not to do that. For reasons that I'll discuss later, I want critters to be able to get to the ground below. But I also, the more densely I pack things, like with Corpus Christi fleabane and Texas frog fruit and lyre-leaf sage, the more densely that I pack these, the more it naturally suppresses weeds that I don't want in my garden bed. So this bed used to actually be infested with, not crabgrass, but something like that. And it's almost all pushed out because of my native ground covers. The aesthetic reason to do this is that having those layers with just the few tall focal plants with medium size around it and then filled in with the ground covers, that is pleasing and reads intentionality. It makes it look intentional and read garden. Biologically, it's also helpful for critters because different critters use plants for nesting, reproduction, shelter in different ways. And so you want some that can take advantage of the lower plants, the medium, and the tall as well. Tip 4, pile it up. So by this, I mean to plant in clusters by species. So let me be very clear. It's not that you have to do this. It's just that the more you tend to group the same, the more you tend to cluster a single species of plants together, the more intentional your garden looks and the more traditional it looks. Does that make sense? So I have an area, not this one, that is really like a small pocket prairie. I just threw like 20 different species of seeds in, grass and forb, and I'll let it roll. And it is all jumbled together and it looks beautiful, but it looks less traditional. In contrast, in this area, I have Gaillardia pulchella, maybe 10 plants here. I have a swath in this area of American germander. I have rough and Texas coneflower here, another thing of firewheel here, and so on and so forth. And so by planting in clusters, it makes it read more intentional. The other reason that we want to plant in clusters is biological. So some insects, especially certain bees, are what we call, they practice what we call flower constancy. So honeybees are an example of this. They want to exhaust the nectar and pollen resources from a particular species of plant before they move on to other species. And so if I plant a bunch of that flower together, they can do all their shopping without exerting a lot of energy. The same for plants whose leaves might be the host for certain caterpillars, for example. If I plant them kind of close together in a cluster, not only aesthetically, but biologically, it might help those specialists. I can do combination patches as well. So the Native Landscape Certification Program of NUPSOD, if you haven't taken any of those classes, I highly recommend them. So I've taken level 1 and 2 already. And in level 2, they talked about pairing different color flowers together to give different feelings. So what you have here is aromatic aster. I think it's probably native to your area, not mine, but it's in my garden. What turns out to have been a cultivar of seaside goldenrod, and here Monarda fistulosa and Rudbeckia texana. But they are opposites on the color wheel. So purple and yellow, they're near opposites. And so this gives energy when I plant them together. In contrast, if I plant plants with flowers that are adjacent on the color wheel, so purple and pink, right? Blue and green and so forth, then those have a calming effect. So we can achieve intentionality and also emotional effect by how we combine. Tip 5, embrace imperfection. So this was the hardest thing. Remember, I talked about it's not just plant choice and not just garden design. We've been talking about those, but it's also maintenance. So maintenance was the hardest thing for me to do, but I made myself to do it, and I invite you to do the same. So we need to leave stems alone after our plants freeze in the winter. The first thing that I want to do after we've had a sharp freeze is I want to get there and cut all those dead stems down, right? I want to cut all those seed heads off. I want to get everything cleared off, but I don't do it now. And here's why. Let's take a look at the left here. So these are old milkweed stems, I think. This one is not, I forget what it is. So about 70% of our native bees nest underground, but about 30% nest above ground. And those that nest above ground, some of them, especially those teeny tiny bees, will nest inside pithy and hollow stems. They're tiny and they can fit inside. And I think even some of our tiny native wasps do. So if I immediately go and cut those down and compost them, for lack of a better way to say it, I might be composting baby bees. Also, some insects shelter in those pithy and hollow stems over winter when it's freezing outside. So I leave them. On the right-hand side, you can see my Texas and rough coneflower seed heads. So for those things that I don't deadhead, I leave them up because birds and other small mammals will eat them over winter and they really depend on them. But if I'm going to cut them off and deadhead them, I just leave them on the ground so that they can still be eaten. Another way to embrace imperfection is to use fallen leaves as mulch very quickly, just to make sure I don't completely run out of time. I have 3 recommendations if you do this. The first is, I don't shred my leaves. I know that they decompose faster if we do, but the reason that I don't is that some butterfly and moss species will pupate on the leaves of deciduous trees that then drop those leaves, and the pupa remains attached to the leaf. So if I shred those leaves, in theory, I could be shredding those pupa, and I don't want to do that. Second tip is make sure that you get the leaves from a yard of someone who doesn't use pesticides or herbicides, or you might be infecting your garden bed with them. And third, I would be careful not to use leaves from trees that have chemicals in the leaves that are allelopathic, meaning that they have chemicals that suppress the growth of other plants. It's a very clever evolutionary trick. So this includes eucalyptus, black walnut. We don't really have much here, but we do have magnolia. So I don't use magnolia leaves because they are allelopathic in chemical composition. And finally, I let early spring wildflowers go. This means that when they pop up in my lawn, I leave them alone. That's because things like crow poison and our different wood sorrel species and even chickweed, now many of these are not native, but some of them are. Nonetheless, I let them persist in my lawn. I do that because nothing else is blooming at the time. They start blooming. I have the oxalis is blooming now in Houston, and the crow poison in the upper left is about to bloom. And my little Andrena mining bees, they love those. So it's just having a conversation with our neighbors so that they understand why I have patches of wildflower in my lawn that I don't mow. And until my other flowers really start blooming regularly, I just let them be. It doesn't mean I have to leave them all over my yard. And here's a great quick fix here. Go ahead and cancel this. To make it look intentional, I lay bricks around the edge of the area that I'm letting processed with wildflowers. So it looks like a bed. And finally, last tip, and we'll end here, stock the nursery. So like I said, about 70% of our native bees and a good number of our native wasps nest underground. Remember, solitary nesters, right? Like single mamas that nest in the ground. This is a furrow bee, Halictus. It's a female, and she has made her nesting tunnel underground, and she's going to provision it with pollen and lay her eggs and then eventually seal it off. So the thing is that if I use thick commercial mulch everywhere in my garden beds, these little mamas, whether they're bee or wasp, won't be able to get into the soil. And if they're in there and their babies hatch, they won't be able to get out. So that's why I tend to use leaves. They tend to be looser. But I also maintain some areas of my garden bed in areas where I don't really go that much as loose, well-drained soil. Ideally, you want a sunny spot. And you leave it alone. No weeding, no tilling. If you get weeds, just clip the weeds down instead of yanking them up. So every garden should have that. And in the handout, there's some links to resources that explain how to do this and where to do it, as well as links to resources describing bee and wasp hotels. And finally, we want to make sure to incorporate host plants for the caterpillars of butterflies and wasps. Remember that many lepidopteran butterfly and moth larvae are specialists on plants in a particular family, genus, or species. So here's the trick. I actually let wasps eat them and other predators. In the wild, only about 1 out of every 100 butterfly eggs makes it to adulthood. So I just they're part of that cycle, that food cycle. So what I do instead is I take my host plants and I weave them throughout the whole garden. That way, if the wasps find 1 or 2 pockets, they don't find them all. So I just want to make sure that I'm feeding not just the adult pollinators, but their babies as well. And that, my friends, is that, and happy wildscaping. Thanks for letting me chat with you.